60 years ago this month, 3 inmates pulled off the impossible. They broke out of the escape-proof Alcatraz federal prison.
They called it unbreakable. Alcatraz, the fortress surrounded by freezing tides and brutal currents, was built to be the end of the line. For decades, the story was simple. 3 men vanished, and the sea claimed them. Case closed. But recently, something hidden beneath the surface, both literally and historically, has come to light. Scientists using advanced technology have found something buried in the bones of the prison itself. And what they discovered is raising urgent new questions. Could the most daring escape in American history have actually worked? What was missed? And why was it hidden for so long? The Mastermind. Frank Morris was no ordinary inmate. His intelligence, discipline, and prior escape history made him a singular figure in the Alcatraz saga. Known for his high IQ, reportedly in the 130s, and strategic mind, Morris wasn't just another convict trying to survive prison life. He was calculating his next move from the moment he arrived. A seasoned escapee with a criminal record stretching back to his teens, Morris had already escaped from the Louisiana State Penitentiary. His relocation to Alcatraz, the nation's most secure penitentiary, was meant to end his evasions. Instead, it became the stage for his most ambitious and legendary act. Unlike impulsive escapees who relied on luck, Morris approached Alcatraz like a problem to be solved. He observed patterns in the guards' routines, noted weak points in the prison's physical structure, and capitalized on the complacency bred by Alcatraz's fearsome reputation. Within weeks, he identified collaborators, John and Clarence Anglin, who shared both his desperation and his discipline. Together, they began to formulate a plan that would take months of careful preparation. Morris's leadership was defined not only by vision, but by operational control. Each member had specific tasks, and each decision was calculated for maximum effectiveness. To bring Morris's talent truly into light, one may note the way he structured the whole infrastructure of the escape. He helped to expose and exploit the long, unused utility corridor and created thereby a hidden staging area. Morris gave meaning to what could otherwise be confinement for the benefit of others, building ventilation disguises, managing tool production, and organizing midnight labor in complete secrecy. This was not a custody escape. It was a highly covert engineering operation. Morris, being able to maintain proper order, focus, and secrecy even under a constant threat of discovery, does show that his mind is trained more like a military tactician than that of a career criminal. What escapes Morris as one of the books in prison history is that it was not just corporeal, it was intellectual. This is one of the rarest instances of cunning that America has witnessed, as it would force even the nation's most impeccable institution to understand its fallibility. In modern history, he is considered not merely a fugitive, but also the mastermind behind one of the most sophisticated escapes. His scheme has not stopped chipping away at the myth of Alcatraz as inescapable, only reminding us that human ingenuity can exploit cracks even in the most fortified of systems. But knowing how Morris planned to escape is only half the story. What they built in secret will blow your mind. Inside the escape. The escape from Alcatraz on June 11, 1962, wasn't the product of reckless desperation. It was a feat of ingenuity, resourcefulness, and silent coordination. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers didn't just flee a prison. They reverse-engineered their way out of one of the most secure facilities in the world. The operation began months in advance and relied on precise planning, not brute force. Armed with only basic tools, a set of spoons, makeshift chisels, and a modified vacuum cleaner motor, the men began the slow and dangerous work of tunneling through cell walls eroded by years of sea air exposure. The 3 men painstakingly carved out holes behind the ventilation grills in their cells, exploiting the crumbling concrete that weakened the structure from within. Each night, they masked their progress with cardboard and painted surfaces, blending their work into the existing cell architecture. Behind the walls lay a narrow utility corridor that allowed them to move unseen. Above this space, they discovered a little-used upper area once designated for storage. This forgotten space would become their clandestine workshop, hidden in plain sight just above the guards' heads. Within their makeshift lab, the trio became somewhat marvelously crafty at escape equipment construction. They assembled a 6-by-14-foot inflatable raft with the aid of 50 stolen raincoats. The seals were made by heat from the steam pipes, rendering the raft waterproof and buoyant. They made up rude paddles and life jackets from coveralls. Reports say that designs were based on prison library documents that showed how inmates used institutional resources against the institution itself. Each was tried, folded, and hidden, waiting for the correct moment of use. It was as planned, military style, when the night finally came. The men crawled through their cell walls, then up the ventilation shaft and across the prison roof, finally climbing down the sheer northern side of the island. They brought their raft to the water's edge, inflated it, and disappeared into the darkness of the bay. The fact that no guard detected them until the morning roll call indicates how thoroughly they had planned each phase. Their escape was as much a feat of physical defiance as it was a demonstration of how intellect and patience could dismantle even the most formidable constraints. The dummy head detection. While most prison escapes rely on brute force or distraction, the 1962 Alcatraz breakout featured a form of psychological warfare that remains one of its most astonishing elements: the use of realistic dummy heads to buy time. Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers understood that even the most well-executed plan would fail if the alarm sounded too early. Their solution? Create decoys so convincing that guards wouldn't notice they were missing until daylight. This delay gave them the critical head start they needed to reach the water and disappear before a search could begin. The heads were crafted with surprising artistry and attention to detail, using soap, concrete dust, toilet paper, and real human hair collected from the prison barbershop. They sculpted lifelike replicas of their own heads. The decoys were designed to appear natural under the dim lighting used during the guards' nighttime bed checks. Carefully placed on the pillows and partially covered by blankets, the heads mimicked the shape and positioning of a sleeping prisoner, exploiting the guards' reliance on routine and visual confirmation rather than close inspection. It was this combination of deep insight into human behavior and institutional complacency that rendered this deception particularly effective. Guards in Alcatraz were accustomed to not bothering inmates during night shifts for any little incidents. By using this procedure and human habit, the escapees manipulated the very system meant to keep them in a cage. It wasn't until the next morning's head count that guards realized that beds were empty and heads were not real. By then, the escapees had been gone for hours, leaving them with an advantage no mere physical tool could ever have secured. Furthermore, the head dummy deception was not just a mere gimmick. Rather, it was high art in the knowledge of psychological field manipulation. This revealed an important vulnerability in Alcatraz's otherwise hard security procedures. The heads now were in the Alcatraz Museum, a chilling reminder that the inmates did not simply outbuild the prison, they outthought it. That tactic testifies to the sophistication of escapees and seals this escape as one of the most ingenious acts of subterfuge in American penal history. The clues authorities tried to ignore. In the wake of the 1962 escape from Alcatraz, authorities quickly declared that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had drowned. It was a convenient conclusion, one that preserved the myth of Alcatraz as escape-proof. But within days, physical evidence began to emerge that challenged this narrative. Fragments of a homemade raft, wooden paddles, and a plastic-wrapped wallet containing family photos and personal information linked to the Anglin brothers were found near Angel Island and the Marin Headlands, areas that were directly in the path of the tidal current if the escapees had timed their departure correctly. The placement of these items raised immediate questions about the official version of events. Oceanographers and later forensic investigators pointed out that if the raft had disintegrated early in the crossing, debris would likely have been pulled westward into the open Pacific Ocean, not northward toward shore. Instead, the items were discovered in logical landing zones that suggested not only that the men had made progress across the bay, but that they may have landed exactly where they intended. The wallet, in particular, was carefully sealed and preserved, implying an intent to protect rather than discard it. Law enforcement and prison officials dug in their heels rather than reconsider their conclusions. They argued that the debris was evidence of failure, not success, and presumably those who escaped panicked and thus discarded their tools midway onto the bay. However, this level of explanation did not gel with the meticulousness of the escape plan, nor with the observed conditions of the items that were retrieved. Some agents, with inside knowledge, raised doubts about the official story, since the narrative offered to the public did not align with the hard evidence they were examining. Still, the position, right or wrong, refused to budge, falling back into the well-rehearsed story that supported institutional reputation over investigatory accuracy. Over the years, these artifacts that were not taken seriously gained greater importance. With cutting-edge equipment like LiDAR mapping and tidal simulations, the physical evidence underwent a more informative analysis. Not merely cast-off remnants, the raft debris and preserved wallet are now closely scrutinized as part of a larger conspiracy surrounding the escape. Whereas before, the investigation sought to undermine or downplay this evidence, it now serves as the very foundation of the argument that the Alcatraz jailbreak was not only possible, but also may have actually succeeded. In so doing, the evidence also shows how the voice of the account can bury even physical evidence when it still comes bobbing back to the surface. Cover-up or incompetence. In the immediate aftermath of the Alcatraz escape, the federal response was swift, confident, and perhaps too rehearsed. Within hours of discovering that 3 prisoners were missing, the FBI, Coast Guard, and Bureau of Prisons began issuing statements asserting that the men had drowned. Search efforts, though highly visible, seemed more focused on supporting this predetermined conclusion than exploring alternate possibilities. As evidence began to surface suggesting a more successful outcome, authorities showed little interest in re-evaluating their position. Instead, the narrative was carefully maintained. Alcatraz had not been breached. Media outlets played a key role in reinforcing this version of events. With statements from federal officials dominating headlines, newspapers and radio reports emphasized the dangers of the cold, turbulent bay waters and the unlikelihood of survival. The discovery of debris was often framed as tragic remnants of a failed escape, rather than signs of progress or success. Behind the scenes, however, some investigative agents reportedly questioned the narrative. Internal documents and later interviews suggest that doubts existed almost immediately, yet the public was never informed of them. One of the principal forces that could have driven the narrative was reputation management. Alcatraz was not just a prison, but also the symbol of total control and inescapability by the federal government. It would have greatly infuriated public confidence in the system as a whole to admit that 3 men outsmarted its tightest security. Some former officials would later admit there was unspoken pressure to avoid hinting at any vulnerability. The instinct of the institution in protecting its mythical infallibility may have been stronger than the drive toward uncovering the full truth. The decades that followed eroded credibility in the official account with this unwillingness to consider alternative explanations. Besides, modern technology and independent researchers exposing formerly hidden chambers and artifacts staged for other purposes triggered increasing doubts about whether drowning fiction was fiction or fear. Today, many interpret that insistence of the government over its narratives not as a mistake, but as willful suppression of the most likely scenario, that escapees made it out, and that for years the system chose to ignore the evidence right in front of it. Just when the official narrative seemed unshakable, science unearthed something no one expected: Pete Kelsey's discovery beneath Alcatraz. In 2025, cutting-edge technology finally caught up with one of America's oldest prison mysteries. Led by digital imaging expert Pete Kelsey, a team of researchers conducted a comprehensive 3D LiDAR scan of Alcatraz Island, revealing long-forgotten architectural features that had gone unnoticed for over 6 decades. Using drones, laser scanners, and robotic rovers, the team generated a digital blueprint of the island that exposed sealed passageways, hollow voids, and concealed chambers, redefining the assumed limits of what had once been considered an escape-proof fortress. One of the most striking discoveries was a hidden cavity behind a maintenance wall near the cell block, previously undocumented in any prison records. Inside, researchers found fragments of stitched raincoat material, rudimentary flotation devices, and concrete surfaces marked with hand-scratched navigation symbols. These arrows and tide notes appeared to point toward Angel Island, echoing the escape route theorized by investigators for years. The location of this space, directly above the cells of the escapees, connected the long-speculated workshop site with physical evidence, confirming that this area was the final staging ground before their disappearance. Lately, Kelsey has basked in findings that not only illuminated Alcatraz's structure's shadowy hidden nooks and corners, but also pointed out how much the prison's design baffled common misconceptions. The once thought to be impervious architecture contained overlooked crawl spaces, blind spots, and interconnecting service tunnels. Escape routes were waiting for someone observant enough to find them. Yet these weren't merely flaws. Particularly, the hidden chamber supplied that all-important missing link in the puzzle, explaining how escapees could have prepared their gear while not being discovered and could hide the equipment in a completely safe but accessible location. LiDAR mapping did much more than confirm long-standing suspicions. It brought about a reckoning with the myth of Alcatraz. Not before was prison a historical artifact or a symbol of invulnerability, but such a layered puzzle of human error and ingenuity, whose secrets were buried under stone and silence for generations. Thanks to Kelsey, clearer it's formed. That was not, after all, just a plausible escape in 1962. It was backed up by physical infrastructure hiding in plain sight. What used to be myth is now science validating it. Several architectural historians added to the mystery by pointing out that some of the original plans for Alcatraz had disappeared or were never digitized, which begs the question of what more might be missing. In interviews, Kelsey himself said that the island was more of a maze than a lockbox, raising the possibility that the design of Alcatraz itself may have inadvertently made it possible for the escape it was intended to stop. Currents of truth. For decades, the heart of the official narrative surrounding the 1962 Alcatraz escape hinged on a single belief: that the waters around the island were simply too cold, too rough, and too unforgiving to survive. Authorities asserted that no swimmer, let alone 3 inmates with a homemade raft, could survive the mile-and-a-half journey through the frigid, current-ridden waters of San Francisco Bay. This idea became foundational to the claim that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers must have drowned. But over time, science began to tell a different story. Oceanographers and forensic analysts, using historical data and modern simulations, revisited the conditions in the bay that night. According to later research, including findings referenced in Britannica and a 2025 CNN report, if the escapees launched their raft between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, the tidal currents would have flowed northeast, directly toward Angel Island and the Marin Headlands. Rather than pushing them out to sea, as previously believed, the current would have actually assisted their journey, increasing the plausibility of a successful crossing. Tidal modeling and temperature assessments gave this alternate scenario further advantage. The water, usually around 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, was not too cold for survival with flotation devices and conditioning, which the escapees had considered. They fashioned life vests out of raincoat materials and likely trained their bodies for exposure. The calculated timing of the escape would suggest a deliberate attempt to take advantage of favorable tidal patterns, as opposed to an act of random, impassioned desperation, trying to swim against inclement forces. These facts have done more than just infringe on outdated assumptions. They have undermined the foundations of the official narrative. In essence, the supposed impossible swim has come to be recognized as a largely self-serving construct forged in the idiom of institutional pride. public reassurance, and not in the arena of objective evidence. When contemporary science is wed with the artifacts recovered off the shore and the fresh remapping of the prison, an even graver truth comes to light. The escapees never gambled against the forces of nature. They understood them. They used that understanding not only to survive in the Bay, but also to outsmart one of the most dreaded prisons in American history. The more the current theories get revised, the more weightful they become, given the success rate of modern open-water swimmers who have completed the same route under more or less similar conditions. Other events, such as the annual Escape from Alcatraz triathlon, similar to the one that swims from the island to the San Francisco shore, have proved that the swim is really possible with the right gear and preparation. Cox also said that with enough insulation and the right timing, such a swim was difficult but far from impossible. These instances in the real world strike at the heart of the propaganda and clamor of the fear industry for decades and prove that the narrative of an inescapable aquatic barrier is probably always more legend than fact. The psychological impact of branding the Bay with deadly qualities helped keep alive Alcatraz's fearsome reputation, but it is abundantly clear that others have dared such waters and crossed over, both before and since the escape. Sightings and secrets. Long after the alarms fell silent at Alcatraz, whispers of survival began to emerge, faint, fragmented, but persistent. In the years following the 1962 escape, the official stance remained that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers had drowned. Yet, across the U.S. and even abroad, reports surfaced of men matching their descriptions. These weren't the wild theories of conspiracy theorists alone. Some came from credible witnesses, former neighbors, law enforcement officers, and most notably the Anglin family, who refused to accept the government's conclusion. The most compelling pieces of this puzzle came in the form of cryptic communications. The Anglin family received unsigned postcards, mysterious phone calls on holidays, and occasional unmarked letters that seemed to allude to the brothers' survival. While none of these messages explicitly confirmed the escapees' identities, the timing and tone were enough to keep the family convinced. According to Ken Widner, a nephew of the Anglin brothers, some of the messages included references only the brothers would know, hints too specific to dismiss. No mystery has fired the public imagination quite as much as the now famous photograph allegedly captured during the 1970s in Brazil. It showed two middle-aged men standing beside a farm shack, resembling a lot like John and Clarence Anglin. For decades, the photo was considered to be coincidental, with no substantial proof to support it, until now, when modern facial recognition software was used on it. Forensic analysts said that the biometric similarities evidenced between the faces in the photo and Anglin's brothers were statistically significant, evidence that undoubtedly ranks this case among the strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence to date. Anecdote sightings, personal messages, and forensics created a fabulous story of an escape that didn't end in the San Francisco Bay, but rather suggested that the escapees lived under assumed identities for decades, and possibly even in South America evading capture. No solid proof exists, such as confirmed DNA or verified address, but the weight of circumstantial evidence continues to sway public opinion. The tale of death by drowning has withered under such meager, scattered but tenacious evidence of life. The possibilities of the so-called sightings have been thrust into the spotlight of public interest through the very means of pop culture and media. Documentaries, dramatized specials, and investigative podcasts have speculated about the very possible survival of the escapees, solidifying the case into a type of modern folklore. Investigative History Channel segments and BBC documentaries have again brought attention to the escape, and with this renewed coverage, amateur sleuths and professional researchers alike are reconsidering the evidence. The resulting curiosity serves to show that stories such as that of Alcatraz remain current, not just for what may have happened there, but equally for what they stand for: a deep-rooted cultural fascination with beating the odds, escaping the system, and rewriting one's fate. In the words of journalist Garrett M. Graff, some mysteries survive because we want them to. Deathbed Confessions and Hidden Players. As the decades passed and those connected to Alcatraz aged, a new layer of the escape story began to surface, one less about speculation and more about confession. Former inmates, guards, and civilians who had once remained silent out of fear or loyalty began to speak up in their final years. Their accounts didn't just support the idea that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers survived, they hinted at a much deeper, more organized effort, suggesting the escape may have involved help both inside and outside the prison walls. One of the most revealing claims came from a former Alcatraz inmate who stated that he had been approached to join the escape but declined, believing it was too risky. He later confessed that he had reason to believe the men survived, based on interactions and overheard conversations in the days leading up to the breakout. Other former prison staff recounted knowledge of infrastructural vulnerabilities that were either ignored or deliberately concealed by officials after the fact, hinting at a quiet effort to protect the prison's reputation rather than investigate its failure. For sure, one of the more explosive revelations came from a Bay Area boat operator who, years later, said he was hired to wait off near Angel Island on the night of the escape. He was paid in cash and told not to ask questions. He had remained silent all these years out of fear of being implicated. His testimony coincides with the timestamps of the escape and the current data suggesting the escapees might have planned for not just a raft trip across the bay, but a rendezvous and pickup for the finishing part of their exit. If this testimony is correct, it indicates a much greater level of coordination and outside help than so far acknowledged. Following those late-in-life statements, a whole new scenario of this escape begins to swirl. Something beyond three men with makeshift tools becomes a conspiracy with calculated silence and bureaucratic complicity. Although many of these stories are not corroborated by written records, their commonality and timing endow them with some credence. They also beg the question, how much did the authorities know, and how much was intentionally buried? As new technologies shine light upon the physical traces, these confessions from real people further complicate the emotional and political landscape of Alcatraz escape, changing it from an open case into a haunting puzzle of secrecy and survival. The intrigue deepens with the uncertain legal status of these late-life confessions. Many of the individuals who came forth did so either knowing that the statute of limitations had run out long ago, or that they were no longer under the immediate threat of prosecution. Perhaps this assurance of legal protection served as the very key to unlocking their silence. Changing cultural attitudes toward whistleblowers and institutional transparency have provided even more reasons to come forward with information once deemed forbidden. From this perspective, the Alcatraz escape becomes not just a historical occurrence, but rather a case of how power can delay truth from manifesting, but never truly erase it. Legal scholars have noted unacknowledged truths have a way of surviving in fragments until the climate is right for them to be heard. And just when it seemed the mystery had reached its limit, the island revealed something even more unsettling. From inescapable fortress to historic puzzle. For much of the 20th century, Alcatraz stood as a symbol of ultimate authority, cold, unyielding, and inescapable. Its isolation in San Francisco Bay, flanked by icy waters and relentless tides, served not only as physical deterrence, but as psychological warfare. The prison was designed less to house inmates than to crush their will to resist. When Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers vanished in 1962, the response from authorities was swift and final. They had drowned. For decades, this explanation went largely unchallenged, reinforcing Alcatraz's image as a place no man could beat. But history is rarely static. In the years since the escape, especially following technological breakthroughs in the 21st century, Alcatraz's myth has begun to unravel. The discovery of hidden infrastructure through LiDAR scans, the resurfacing of credible sightings, and modern forensic analyses of artifacts have reshaped the narrative. No longer seen merely as an impenetrable institution, Alcatraz is now viewed as a layered puzzle, one whose secrets were not lost to time, but buried beneath decades of assumption and bureaucracy. It has changed cultural roots quite deeply. The most celebrated prison escape is being re-evaluated from failed attempts to prison breaks. Today, visitors do not only walk through ruins, they immerse themselves in the crime scene where clues continue to emerge. Tour guides speak less hopelessly about confinement and more ingeniously about challenging the system. Questions now arise in every corridor, cell, and sealed tunnel. What other things were missed? Who else knew? Might something still lie buried under concrete? This new Alcatraz has redefined escape, making it no longer spectacular but the iconic event itself. It reminds us that institutions, however strong, are vulnerable to the creativity and resolve of the human spirit. The legacy of Alcatraz no longer speaks of cautious confinement and punishment. It narrates a story of defiance and technology combined with the quiet possibility that even the most secure systems could be outsmarted, instead of with violence, with thought and time. The rock stands still, but the story it tells is no longer the one for which it was built. The epistemological shift has likewise set up kudos for yet another mode of telling their stories by various authors, filmmakers, and academicians. Documentaries like Alcatraz, Search for the Truth, and exhibitions held by the National Park Service incorporate whole-feather theories, once brushed off as fringe. In the meantime, criminal justice scholars now use the Alcatraz escape in discussions concerning broader themes of institutional failure and control over narrative. As observed by historian Paul H. Robinson, when the official version of a story depends on denying observable evidence, it says more about the system than the event. The new cultural inquiry has thus suggested that the Alcatraz escape is no longer merely a story of prisoners, but is now a challenge for society to examine power, secrecy, and shifting thresholds of truth. Thanks for watching. If this discovery blew your mind, don't forget to like the video, drop a comment with your theory about the escape, and subscribe for more unbelievable true stories. And hey, don't stop here. Click the next video on your screen to keep uncovering the mysteries they never wanted you to know. See you there.